So now we're going to move on to the 32nd person to be president of the United States, Harry Truman. Again, the 5 criteria we look at as kind of guideposts are growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and of course the most important, did they leave the country better or worse than they found it? Truman is the poster child for why you should not assess a presidency until some time has passed. As I said, starting this video off, this whole series off, I'm not going to be going all the way up to current presidents. I'm definitely going to be skipping Biden and Trump. I'm probably going to skip Obama. I keep getting tempted, but I probably am going to skip it. And I'm probably going to stop at George W. Bush because you have to have enough time pass before you can assess a presidency. If you don't allow enough time to pass before you assess a presidency, you're stuck in what is immediately happening and not really discussing the things that came as a result of what was decided. Truman is a great example of this. In fact, you could argue that you really couldn't fully assess the Truman presidency until the 80s. Because a lot of the decisions that he made were pivotal decisions that I think at the time, well, I know at the time were incredibly unpopular, but over time historians have looked back on more favorably than the people at the time did, because they turned out to be, if not perfect decisions, decisions in the right direction. So let's start in terms of growth and with a perfect example. Truman's decision to desegregate the military was huge. I think you can very strongly argue that the Dixiecrat movement came out of Truman's civil rights move in that direction, specifically in the military. I think that was a sign to the South that we were going in a different direction. It was one of the first serious blows to Jim Crow. Roosevelt never really wanted to touch that third rail. Roosevelt seemed to be more willing to negotiate with the South to give them things like redlining to keep segregation in place. He would speak to certain things to try to get black voters, and black voters having very few options. In the North, obviously, black voters in the South really had no ability to vote because Jim Crow was still in full effect and it was dangerous to vote. There were some exceptions, but on the whole, it was very dangerous still to vote in the South if you were black. But in the North, they were becoming a large enough voting bloc that they had to be taken somewhat seriously. And the GOP had largely abandoned even the pretense. I think resting on their laurels of being the party of Lincoln, they were hoping that they would be able to keep that vote. And then because they felt like there were very few options, they didn't really have to go toward that. I don't think Truman did it in any way as a political decision. I don't think Truman did much of anything in terms of his decision making for political purposes. I think he did what he thought was necessary and right. And I think he was wrong sometimes, but I think he always had the intentions of doing what he believed was the right thing to do. With regards to the creation of the Dixiecrat Party and how that eventually led to the splitting of the Democratic Party, the loss of the Solid South, what I refer to later as, and we'll talk about later, the Southern strategy versus the Wallace Democrats that kind of really came to a head in the 70s. We'll get to all that later. This was the beginning of that, and it was a decision Truman made aggressively that he didn't have to make. I would say a lot of the things Truman did, he did with purpose and aggression, or at least maybe not aggression. Aggression may not be the right word, but something akin to decisiveness. And it really hurt him. I think one of the reasons people assumed he was going to lose his reelection campaign is because he knew he was going to lose the Solid South. Strom Thurmond running as a Dixiecrat, splitting the party, and yet he did win. It was a surprise. You have that big poster that people show of big picture of Truman showing the Dewey wins headline that wasn't true. That Truman did win the election. But it was a bold decision, and I think it set the foundations for the civil rights movement. And I think that was a huge thing that led to what I will say is one of the major pivot points in American history. And I believe that was a huge benefit to the country in terms of growing us as a nation, in terms of having a part of our, when you have an entire group of people who are not able to participate in the economy. This is why Wilson, despite all of his flaws, still did okay, because suffrage is such a big thing. When you allow people to participate and be of benefit to the country, rather than having them locked away and only allowed to do certain things, that is a huge driver of economic growth. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the post-war economy grew so quickly as we began expanding civil rights generally. And I think Truman deserves a lot of credit for starting that, probably more than FDR in a lot of ways. FDR did give African Americans more access to things than they had before, but he was still more than willing to reach out to the Southern South politically on things like redlining. In terms of finances, you can point to the debt, and I think it's fair to point to the debt. Truman did have a large debt, but Truman was also taking office while World War II was still going on. I think people sometimes forget, and they forget or don't forget, that the war was still taking place when Truman took over in the Pacific. The war wasn't over. The debt consistently, but went down as far as the debt spending throughout Truman's term in office, and it was going to start high because of World War II. It was going to stay high because of the Korean War, which we'll get to later. And those are huge expenses, and that's something that Eisenhower will talk about the military-industrial complex. But I also think Truman's decision-making prevented a collapse that, like what happened when what happened to the Wilson administration after World War I, where everyone came home and there was nothing to do. Now, were there things that he did that were very sketchy, in my opinion? Yes, the threatening to draft the railway workers during the strike, and the attempt actually to nationalize steel mills during the Korean War. Truman definitely, in a different time, could have been persuaded to be more Wilsonian in terms of abuse of power. But during his time, I think he was the right person at the right moment to address many of these things, even if he went too far on some occasions. I think this was a time where bad things could happen if you had someone who was less decisive. This was not a time for a Neville Chamberlain type of leader. Which brings us to international politics, which is an area I would say I give Truman very high marks for. And I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of the things Truman did were incredibly controversial, and I want to deal with the biggest controversy, and that is the dropping of the two atomic bombs on Japan. I can completely see an argument against the second bomb, and I can even kind of see an argument against the first bomb. But I am going to make the argument as to why I would defend those actions in context of what happened later. I'm not saying they were done for the right reasons. I'm saying the outcomes that came, because that was the decision was made, were better outcomes than I think would have happened had it been done a different way. And that is the occupation of Japan. I don't think an invasion of Japan would have been beneficial to anyone involved. I think, absent the dropping of the two atomic bombs, which led to the unconditional surrender of the emperor, and the seeming understanding of the military of the precariousness of their position, I think Japan might have fought to the last. I think Japan had a mentality at that point where they seemed to be willing to continue fighting even though the war was long lost. Because by that point, the war was long lost. One of the reasons they were able to drop the bomb was they had achieved air superiority. And the amount of deaths is there's no way to justify that. There's no way to argue that it needed to happen, particularly on the second dropping on Nagasaki. Perhaps you can argue, and perhaps it would be true, that the first atomic bomb was enough. But they didn't immediately surrender after the first atomic bomb. Perhaps they were thinking you only have one. And then the second one was like, oh, you do have two. And at that point, we had a full unconditional surrender. And where I give Truman credit is we didn't become a colonial power. We didn't occupy Japan with no exit strategy. We didn't occupy any of the countries with no exit strategy in terms of Germany, in terms of any of the holdings. Truman took the approach of decolonization seriously. He walked the walk. And if you look at what happened to Japan and Germany relative to World War II versus World War I, particularly for Germany, but for Japan as well, these were countries that were able to recover economically and then stop being threats. They were not countries we had to occupy. We didn't have a long occupation like we would have later with Vietnam, or we would have later, what the Soviets had with Afghanistan, or that we had with Afghanistan, or any of these other situations where we were an occupying power. And I think absent the atomic bombs, we may have had to become an occupying power. There may have been a continued guerrilla war because hope wasn't lost. I do think the two atomic bombs forced the Japanese leadership to abandon hope and surrender unconditionally. And I think Truman's approach of still after you've unconditionally surrendered, allowing a pathway to return to self-governance in a reasonable amount of time. That's not what normally happens, and I think you really have to acknowledge how amazing that was that it happened that way. And then the second thing you have to talk about, which is incredibly controversial, is the Korean War. And here's all I'm going to say about the Korean War. We are now well past it, 60, 70 years, something in that range by math. I'm not a math major, I'm a history major. And we have North Korea and South Korea to look at as comparative. I think it's clear that South Korea is preferable to North Korea. I think it's clear, absent American intervention, North Korea would have occupied all of Korea. And I think that would have been a negative outcome for the world. I think similarly, the Berlin airlift, preventing the Soviet occupation of Berlin, and we've seen what the Eastern Bloc countries were versus the Western countries. I don't say this in a way of saying that the West is infallible. I don't say this in a way of saying the West is not horribly flawed. We will get to some of those things in the not too distant presidencies. But I do think we have to have the discussion with regards to international politics and war and security to say that, yes, Truman started the Cold War, but it was a necessary war. And it didn't escalate to a hot war at any point. When it finally ended in the 80s, for all intents and purposes, unless you want to argue that the current Ukrainian process around NATO is an extension of the Cold War, which you could. It's fair. But I think once you get to the 80s, I think you can say that it was necessary for the West to be a bulwark against the expansion of the Soviet Union and the expansion of communist China at the time. I think that is a fair statement, and I think it was the right decision, and I think you have to give Truman credit for that. You don't necessarily have to give him full credit on how he executed the wars, which is why his war and security number is not going to be incredibly high, although I do think firing MacArthur was the right decision. MacArthur is incredibly overrated on so many levels, but that's another discussion entirely. And I do think you can give him serious criticism with regards to security because of his threats to the rail workers and to, nationalize the steel. But I think the Truman Doctrine of containing communism turned out to be the correct decision to make. And I also think that his decision with regards to helping Germany recover, the Marshall Plan, taking in 400,000 refugees, I think all of the things that were done to prevent the next war deserve a lot of credit, and that's why I give him a high score in terms of international politics and a relatively high score in terms of war and security and in terms of better or worse. I would also note that I think the post-war boom coming from things like the GI Bill kind of also falls not entirely on his ledger. I think Eisenhower will get some credit for that, and even Kennedy and LBJ will get some credit for that. But I think we could have easily had a reenactment of what happened after World War I, and we didn't. We had a relatively stable, if tense, world for the next up to now. And that's remarkable. That is not what came before, as we've been discussing this. That was a remarkable change. I also think you have to give him a knock for McCarthyism. I think the Red Scare and McCarthyism fall on his ledger. Could it be avoided? I think parts of it could. I think it went to extreme levels, and I think that part needs to be talked about also when you're talking about Truman. I think that's why I'm not going to put him in my absolute upper echelons. I mean, there's lots of reasons he's not in the absolute upper echelons, but I do think that's a strike against him. So taking all those things into consideration, where does he fall? Well, he's certainly not in the top two. I have been looking at these for a while. I think he's going to be below both of the Roosevelts, but I am going to put him above Polk at number 7. I think he was an effective president who left the country better than it was. I think he had flaws. I think he was taking a country that was going in the right direction, and I think a lot of the decisions he made were a bit wild and perhaps not the ideal decisions, but I think the direction that he took the country in, and I think where it eventually ended up, I think you have to give him full credit for. Certainly much more credit than he got at the time when he was an unpopular president leaving office. So again, Harry Truman, I'm going to put him at number 7 so far.